Hi, all. I'm Professor Tina Good, and this week we are beginning to play Real Women Have Curves. This week's assignment is going to focus on a silenced character known as Mrs. Glitz. How do we know she's silenced? She literally has no lines. No actor has been assigned her part, and yet it can be argued that she is one of the most powerful characters in the play. So, your writing assignment, your writing response will be looking at this character. I'm asking you to consider the paradoxical role that she plays, that she is seemingly empowering these women to have jobs, to have careers, to have their factory, and yet simultaneously seems to be exploiting them at the same time. So, what I'm going to ask you to consider is, do you think that Mrs. Glitz is an empowering character? Now, remember, that is not the same as powerful. We know that Mrs. Glitz is powerful. She owns the Glitz company. Um, and so she has a lot of power in the industry. She has a contract with Bloomingdale's where she sends her product. But can we say that she's empowering? That is to say, is she helping other people find their own power, find their own way, right, in their worlds? Or do you think she's disempowering, right? Is she actually discouraging their success, finding ways to oppress them, finding ways to keep them down, right? So consider that question when we're thinking about Mrs. Glitz. And let's make sure that we understand her business relationship with Estella. Okay. The women and Estella do not work for Mrs. Glitz. Okay. Mrs. Glitz and the Glitz Company is a customer of Estella, right? Estella and Mrs. Glitz have entered into a contractual relationship that, as contracts are considered to be mutually agreed upon. Okay, so that contract specifies that they will have these orders of dresses that they will make, and that if they do not meet the deadline, for turning in those dresses to Mrs. Glitz, that Mrs. Glitz does not have to pay them. Okay, this is a pretty drastic contract. And in fact, these types of contracts are now considered illegal. But Mrs. Glitz, there's a moment where she appears to be generous because she says, all right, if you get all of the dresses done by this Friday, I will pay you for all of them. And so there seems to be this generosity, but is she actually being generous? And another thing to consider is that the women in the factory do not work for Mrs. Glitz. So the working conditions in the factory are Estella's responsibility, not Mrs. Glitz's responsibility. So be sure to keep that in mind when you are considering the character of Mrs. Glitz. Also, make sure that you understand that everything that we are getting about Mrs. Glitz is mediated through Estella. Okay, everything we know about Mrs. Glitz is coming through Estella's perspective. Is Estella a good source for that? Is she a credible source for helping us understand Mrs. Glitz? Might she be biased? Might she be representing Mrs. Glitz in an unfair way, right? So it's your job as a literary analyst to pull back and be objective and not just look at Mrs. Glitz through Estella's point of view, but look at the whole situation in its entirety and consider what might be Mrs. Glitz's perspective. Okay. And so finally, I want you to consider whether or not you like Mrs. Glitz, right? Just think about your own reactions to Mrs. Glitz. Do you like her? And then discuss why or why not, right? And make sure that when you're submitting your response, that it is a full page minimum, right? That does not include the name at the top of the paper and the title and all of that heading information, that it should be a full page minimum of your response. Make sure you avoid plot summary when doing your response and focus on your analysis of the character. That is 1 page minimum, typed, double-spaced, Times New Roman 12. Make sure you submit it on Brightspace as a Microsoft Word or PDF document. So I hope you enjoyed this assignment, and we will be talking soon more about the play.